Hi, everybody. Tom Simmons and the Priest in the Hot Seat podcast. Can we rely on the Gospels and what they say about Jesus? That's a question that Charles Murray asked in his journey from dead zero, baseline acceptance of the secular creed, through the first nudges moving him little by little to consider the possible validity of Christian faith. And then he began to embrace the idea of the Creator God when he thought through the implications of the Big Bang. We've walked with him on this journey where he concluded that if the cosmos had a beginning, then they had to have a beginner. And as he studied the evidence of fine-tuning needed to make this complex life that we experience possible in this vast, hostile universe, he began to appreciate the impact that Christianity has had on the world. When he was writing his book in the 1990s on arts and sciences, he realized that Christianity has a uniquely powerful influence in the world of thought. And all this led Murray to consider the possibility that the man at the heart of it, Jesus of Nazareth, might have something to say, which brought him to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and teaching. So this brings us up to chapters 9 and 10 of his book, Taking Religion Seriously. Raised for him the question, can I trust the Gospels? And the answer to that is disputed. There has been a lot of scholarship in the last century and a half, 2 centuries, disputing the origin and reliability of those texts, critically appraising them and disputing their legitimacy. This is a revisionist approach that has argued that these documents were originally written by groups over time, anonymously. These manuscripts were not assigned a name because they were written in a decades-long iterative process. They were later augmented and redacted repeatedly through this process of revision, and they theorized that the historical Jesus was an extraordinarily charismatic leader, and that in the decades after his death, many legends of miracles and divine identity grew into the text like barnacles. These texts were then assigned authors in order to confer authority on them. Hence we get Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Murray explored these arguments, and he discovered, to his surprise, that he was more persuaded by the traditional approach. The traditional approach says that the authorship of the 4 Gospels was well known in the early church, that these 4 accounts of the life of Jesus were widely accepted very early in the church's life as authoritative because of the obvious credentials of their authors. The uniform witness of the figures that followed the apostolic generation is united on this. So you have the apostolic generation, right? Most of whom died by 70 AD. John, the last of them, is thought to have lived well beyond that. And he was able to disciple people like Papias, who lived from 60 to 130 AD. He was able to talk with the surviving witnesses, John and others, as he gathered information there in the 80s and 90s AD. There was Irenaeus. He lived from 115 to 180 AD. He was a student of Polycarp, who knew John and his circle of surviving eyewitnesses. Irenaeus was a scholar with access to early Christian writings, no longer in circulation. There's Clement of Alexandria there in Egypt, who lived from 150 to 215. He was a scholar with access to early Christian writings that he refers to that are no longer in circulation. So he had access to the very earliest documents of the apostles in the generations that followed. There was Eusebius. He was a scholar also with access to early Christian writings, no longer in circulation. And he had a unique perch as the custodian of the library there at Caesarea, which was the Roman capital of the province of Judea and repository of the most complete documentation of the early church. Now, of course, very scant remains of these early writings continue to us today. But we can read these guys and know that they had read everything before them, which is a really remarkably complete picture historically, textually, of that early first century and then the transition after the apostles into the life of the church in the second century. Now, Murray then focuses in on the gap between the events of the Gospels, the events in the life of Jesus and his chosen followers, and the eventual recording of those on paper. The more we learn about that early first century, the shorter that gap gets. Now, when I was in seminary back in the early 1990s, critical scholarship routinely argued that the New Testament documents had been authored as late as 110 AD. That's 80 years after Jesus' death. And I was surprised to read Murray here that revisionist dating of the last New Testament documents written was a maximum of 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. I was surprised because he's considerably more up to date on his scholarship than I was. I read about that stuff back in the 90s. He's been doing it in the last decade. And that time span, that gap has gotten smaller, which means that we're talking about 70 to 90 AD, which is when contemporary scholarship sees the writing of the New Testament documents. I was very surprised to hear that. And when you think about it, that's just 40 years after the death of Jesus. It's not a long time. I mean, what happened 40 years ago? How about this? When Space Shuttle Challenger exploded during takeoff. I remember that day. I remember it. I was a freshman in college. I remember seeing it on the TV screens in the student, what do we call it? in the student lounge there in the campus center at JMU. 40 years is not a lot of time. Here's some perspective on that. Alexander the Great, the gap between his life and its recording was 350 years. Or how about Muhammad? The gap between his life and its recording by other sources was 130 years after his death. So 40 years is not long at all. Now, Murray points out that more and more New Testament scholars are accepting the likelihood that all the New Testament writings were put down on paper before 70 AD, which is pretty remarkable. That would mean the earliest New Testament Gospels would have been written perhaps within 15 to 30 years of Jesus' death. And it's a very interesting argument why that would be, because none of the New Testament documents mentions the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. You'd think that the most turning point moment in Jewish history would be mentioned, but it's not in the New Testament, not even in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation itself assumes that the temple was still standing because John was asked to go and measure it. Another important point is that there's no mention in the book of Acts of the death of Paul or Peter, both of whom are characters throughout that narrative. Both of them were killed by Nero, probably in the year 62 AD, 62, 63 AD. They were both martyred. Neither death was mentioned at the book of Acts, which means Acts was written while they were still alive, which means that Luke was written before Acts. So we're talking in the 50s AD, potentially, for the authorship of the Gospel of Luke. Now, it has long been theorized that Mark was the first gospel, that Luke and Matthew both used Mark as a source, which would mean that Mark would have to precede Luke. So now we're getting into the early 50s, perhaps AD, when Mark was written. So these are very interesting arguments and implications. And, for the last century and a half, the assumption of critical New Testament scholarship is that New Testament authorial process was very free and open in adding and editing and augmenting these texts with stories to make the simple life of Jesus appear more grand. But if they were so free and open in doing that kind of editorial addition, why didn't any of them mention the martyrdom of Peter and Paul? How come nobody ever went back to kind of clean up the conclusion of the book of Acts, to bring those stories, those lives of Peter and Paul to a fitting close? It's really a very hard question to get around. Folks, if you like the Priest in the Hot Seat podcast, I ask you to do two things. One, send it to a friend, because that's how these things go viral. And two is, if you have a question that you'd like me to try to answer, then put it in the comment section below. Thanks, and I'm really glad to have you here for critical New Testament scholarship, which is why more and more the scholarly consensus of New Testament scholarship says that these have to be early rather than late, that they are eyewitness testimony, and that there's really very little room for augmentation with other stories. And Murray has a lot else to say about other forms of evidence that convinced him that these Gospels are authentic. You'll just have to read his book to get that. Although I do want to mention one very significant piece of evidence. He spends his final pages talking about the resurrection. This is the most controversial myth of the Gospels, the idea that Jesus walked out of the grave after being crucified by Romans. And Murray was surprised to learn that a strong majority of historians, both Christian and non-Christian, skeptical, believe, have embraced the basic fact pattern of the story of Jesus' resurrection. And I think the person who's done the best work on this is Dr. Gary Habermas. He's dedicated his academic career to analyzing every little scrap of historical information about the resurrection, and he has also done a marvelous job of comprehensively studying everything that's ever been written about it over the centuries. He is a master of all critical scholarship regarding the resurrection, and he has distilled 12 what he calls minimum facts about the resurrection. And by minimal fact, he means facts that 95% of scholars of all stripes, all inclinations of faith and ideology, belief, atheists, Jews, Christians, all stripes, 95% of them acknowledge these 12 minimal facts. The first, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion just outside of Jerusalem. The second, Jesus was buried in the tomb of a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. The third minimal fact that 95% of scholars agree on is that Jesus' disciples were defeated, scattered, shattered, and grieving after his crucifixion. Fourth, the tomb was found empty 3 days later on Sunday. Fifth minimal fact, on multiple occasions, in various circumstances, numerous people and groups of people reported seeing Jesus alive after his death. No historian of the New Testament disputes this. Sixth minimal fact. The disciples were transformed by these experiences. Seventh, the resurrection became their central message from that day forward. Eighth, they preached this message in Jerusalem within weeks, reporting the resurrection of Jesus. 9, they established many communities among people newly converted to this message. 10, these Jewish believers suddenly changed the primary day of worship from Saturday, which is the Sabbath, to Sunday. Like, how do you get Jewish believers to change the day of the Sabbath? The 11th minimal fact, and here I'm going to have to take a shoe off. Jesus' brother, James, was converted. Though a skeptic during Jesus' lifetime, how did his brother become a believer and a leader of the church after Jesus' death? He reported an encounter with the risen Jesus after his crucifixion. And the 12th minimal fact, Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor of the early church, suddenly became a Christian after an encounter that he had, reported in the book of Acts, chapter 9, an encounter with Jesus after his death. This fact pattern is undisputed, which Charles Murray found very persuasive. After his long inculcated, blindly accepted secular creed, Charles Murray embraced the resurrection of Jesus based on scholarly consensus on the reliability of the Gospels. Charles Murray has embraced this faith, and as he describes in the final chapters, this journey of discovery continues for him. He has embraced the faith because it is so compelling. How about you? I would love to hear where you are in your journey of discovery in the comment section below. Thanks. Now, if you like this episode, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell so that you know the next time we drop a Priest in the Hot Seat episode. And help us make this thing go viral by sending it to your friends. Thanks, and God bless you.